All right, rejoining the channel is two-time Moochie award-winning Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute, beaming in live from London. Justin, great to see you again, as always.
Likewise, Mooch.
So we were just chatting. You had some recent experience with the Polish Air Force flying a MiG-29. Talk to us about your impressions from that hop.
Summary would be loads of power when the burners are on. A lot of drag, so it accelerates very nicely in the slow speed arena, sort of flight regime. And if you get your opponent in within visual range slow and close, then it's a monster. You know, the stuff that it can do in the vertical and sort of rolling scissors in the 100, 120 knots range in full burner is really impressive. But situational awareness is very, very limited. The radar is not up to much. It was pretty good for its day, but its day was a very, very long time ago. The radar warning receiver really is not appropriate for modern threats. And the cockpit workload is pretty high, as you'd expect. It's not a carefree aeroplane. Very, very skillful crews who fly it and maintain it. The Polish ones are beautifully maintained. But, you can see it's complex. And the trade-off for having all of that power is that when you're in burner, the fuel goes really fast. The fuel load is not dissimilar to an F-16, but you're burning about twice as much gas in burner. So, with no air-to-air refueling, persistence is really limited. So very, very, amazing fun and absolutely fascinating. But that the transition from that to an F-16 or another Western fighter will be there'll be a lot of changes, both from a maintenance point of view and from an aircrew point of view. Certainly, no doubt, if I had to pick, an F-16 or a Gripen or anything Western against the MiG-29 to go into any kind of threat environment, the choice would be immediate and obvious. But it's very, very cool and extremely impressive the way that the Polish Air Force continues to, not for very long, I think, but continues to squeeze some value out of what is a pretty obsolescent platform at this point.
So I remember in the mid-90s, a guy named Woody Horan, who went on to make admiral, but at this time he was a senior lieutenant, fresh from test pilot school, was one of the first Americans to fly the MiG-29 in the former East Germany with the now German Air Force as the wall came down. And his impression was, as you say, let's call it ergonomics of the cockpit was counterintuitive, and I'm sort of making it up here, but it's like altimeter, airspeed, fuel flow all over the place, right? Not, as you say, nothing close to a glass cockpit, and even in a steam gauge environment, kind of haphazard. Maybe that was his impression. Was that your impression as well?
There's probably a lot. I'm sure there is a logic to the way that the information is kind of laid out in the cockpit, but it's deeply counterintuitive if you come from, or even in my case, just have experience with Western cockpit layouts. I really found it was quite striking when, if you're just on the ground or you're doing pre-flights and you're kind of being shown how it all works and where to look at things, it's all fine. You go, okay, I get this. But as soon as you're trying to do stuff in the air, and in my case, the front seat is saying, keep it at this speed, this AOA, and I'm just under pressure looking in the wrong place, and it's really kind of takes you out of it. And feel is quite interesting. Like, obviously, it's a completely manual airplane, and it's hydromechanical, so you don't have a flight control system as such. Like, it's not a digital FCS. So in some ways, it's really nice because you can feel everything. On the other hand, the stick forces are pretty high. And you have to constantly trim it. And as you get faster, the stick actually moves physically forwards, which is kind of interesting. Really, really cool. And huge respect for the pilots who fly it, especially Ukrainians who are flying it in combat in a hugely high threat environment. To be able to manage the aeroplane's complexities and kind of the navigation, the fuel, the threat environment. Incredible respect for them. But yeah, it would really scare me, the idea of having to go into any kind of serious threat environment with that poor SA and that high cockpit workload, as well as the limited fuel really hurts because for example, if you imagine in a composite air operation, a Cameo as in a Western style Air Force, if you have to Rolex 10 minutes, somebody's gone US number 4 on one flight element's gone US, and so they're 10 minutes late taking off, or you have to the ground operation is slow, or the Navy is involved in any way. I'm joking. So things don't go quite to timeline, especially in a multinational context. There's always some foul up somewhere. It's fine. You hit the tanker if you need to. You just hold, and everybody kind of adjusts their flight plan and their context and moves forward accordingly, or goes to max endurance if you don't have a tanker involved, and you orbit and you wait. In a MiG-29, you really can't do that because the fuel burn is so high, and partly yes, of course you can fly it in max endurance, but it's quite a draggy airframe, and so you're still at a reasonably high power level, at admin speeds. You don't have a lot of time, and a lot of variants, including the polished ones, don't have air-to-air refueling at all as an option. So, but very, very impressive. The engines are amazing in their brute power. It's huge diameter things. The afterburner response is really impressive. I think it's within, I think they said 80 revolutions that you go to full burner when you select when you go past the gate. And yeah, you feel it. It's a cool piece of kit.
So let's pivot to the subject at hand here. Your latest essay at RUSI is a topic that we've chatted about adjacently before, but you hit it head on here. The headline is, NATO should not replace traditional firepower with drones. Over-reliance on uncrewed aerial systems or drones is leading to significant problems for the armed forces of Ukraine and is not something Western militaries should attempt to replicate. So talk to us about the points you bring up here.
First and foremost, a disclaimer. This is not intended to be a criticism of the choices that the armed forces of Ukraine, the AFU, and the Ukrainian state have made. But it is trying to point out that where they find themselves, which is increasingly heavily relying on a whole host of UAS types, so from small FPV type and small first-person view UAS through one-way attack drones. Sort of there are many, many different types of one-way attack drones, which are essentially propeller-powered light cruise missiles that they use in very large numbers to get through and harass targets in the deep. They are increasingly relying on these things to fill in for shortcomings in the number of artillery barrels, artillery ammunition, anti-tank guided missiles, and things like anti-tank artillery rounds. So particularly, there's a really, really cool thing called a bonus round, which is essentially an artillery round 155 that releases a couple of skeets, which seek for targets and then fire for vehicle targets, heat signatures when it bursts, and then will fire shape charges down into vehicles. Very, very effective. But of course, they're relatively scarce. And so they're very highly prized by Ukrainian commanders. And what you're finding is that as the West has failed to collectively keep pace with supplies of things like artillery barrels, shells, and ATGMs, all of these things which for Ukraine are very difficult to produce in quantity, sufficient quantity in Ukraine, because any very large factory that you set up will get struck very quickly by Russian ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and one-way attack, Garan or Shahid style one-way attack drones. The AFU have had to respond by sort of doubling down on UAVs and producing, I think, 2.2 million UAVs last year, and they're on course. They've got a target for 4.5 million this year. You've seen also on the Russian side, as they run shorter of barrels and armored fighting vehicles and continue to increase the size of their force, they are also doubling down on FPV and loitering munition type drones, as well as battlefield reconnaissance ones for their much larger amounts of artillery that they still have. And so this has led a lot of people to kind of look at that and with perfectly reasonable intentions and entirely understandably go, okay, so this is what war looks like now. It's literally millions of UAVs. Therefore, all of our legacy systems are very, very inefficient. And we obviously, particularly in Europe, as having given away most of our heavy equipment to Ukraine, and we didn't have enough to begin with. We should have had more to begin with. We should have spent more on it. Basically, a whole bunch of people, particularly in the non-specialist policy and sort of senior military, have kind of absorbed this, but either consciously or tacitly, and kind of gone, right, so the future is drones, and anything that isn't drones is inefficient legacy, etc. In more specialized communities, you don't get this, and a lot of people who work specifically on UAVs, on artillery, on tanks, on aircraft, will read this and go, yeah, duh, obviously, when nobody's saying we should replace them. But unfortunately, a lot of policymakers and senior military are looking to essentially bet big for their lethality as they try and rebuild Russia-focused European armies and armed forces on replicating the Ukrainian approach. I think that's a really big risk, because the four main sort of tenets of the argument are: firstly, Russia is now very, very good at counter UAS. They have had 3.5 years of high intensity combat against Ukraine since the full scale invasion. Ukraine started to do very, very impressive things with UAVs at relatively large scale pretty early on in the war, but particularly for the last 2 years has been relying heavily and increasingly on UAVs. And Russia started off with an enormous amount of short-range air defense and kind of AAA and basically short-range, relatively cheap stuff for shooting at things in the air compared to any normal Western army. So they already had quite a lot of SHORAD, which on its own is not particularly good at dealing with UAVs, as we've seen from them hunting down Pantsers and Taurus and things. But they also had a lot of EW equipment. And so the adaptation has been pretty quick. And what you now see is that the Russians are increasingly good at counter UAS, both hard and soft kill, and both active and passive measures to reduce the effectiveness of lots and lots of UAVs. You can never eliminate it entirely, but you can't eliminate the effectiveness of bullets or shells either, are everywhere in the Russian armed forces. All their vehicles have bar armor, infrared sort of blankets to cover the high value things like tanks, to make it more difficult to spot them in hides with infrared things at night if you're looking for them. They have tactical jammers for the most part, so that FPV drones without a spool or without careful use of anti-EW techniques will tend to lose the picture as they get closer. There's also much bigger strategic and operational level EW systems that they use. But also, the Russians have gotten increasingly and disturbingly good at direction finding and then killing Ukrainian UAV operator teams. And this gets to the second point of the argument, which is not just, is it a bad idea for European NATO forces to bet big on replicating the Ukrainian approach as the primary tool in their lethality, replacing old things like artillery and tanks, which they now need to either rebuild or replace with something. It's not only a bad idea because Russia is actually very good at counter-UAS, but it's also, the second point being that as Ukraine relies more and more heavily on these things, more and more of Russia's efforts, both at an industrial, technological, and tactical level, go into countering UAVs. And so they are going to increase the rate at which they improve in the counter-UAS space. We've already seen significant impact since last August from them concentrating a lot of their counter-UAV tactical and technical development under what's called the Rubicon unit or center, which Mike Kaufman and friend Stefan Gady recently did some really good work talking about from their most recent trip. But essentially, the Russian system is very good at, or comparatively speaking, tends to be pretty good at dealing with a small number of problems that they are then instruct their personnel and their industry to prioritize. What they're generally not very good at doing is responding to lots of little problems that are difficult to precisely identify from the top level, but their personnel understand at the operational level. So that bottom-up adaptation, they're not very good at. Top-down, they're pretty good at. And so given that it's now a pretty obvious priority for them, that will continue. So if you're a European army looking at this, and you're thinking, what should I do so that in 2 or 3 years' time I have much more lethality than I have now against Russian forces, let alone a joint force, looking to try and copy the Ukrainian approach, I don't think is a good idea at all, because it plays directly to Russia's existing strength and what they are prioritizing getting better at in the interim. The third point is Western forces and countries in Europe particularly are likely to be significantly worse at UAVs than the Ukrainians are, because the Ukrainians have had 3.5 years of desperate existential war, of pressure, as it were, to get this right. They have large parts of their economy and society looking at how to improve drone production, drone usage. It's a huge part of the way that their armed forces function. And so from every level, from the industrial and from partners as well, both industrial and national partners, outside Ukraine, but also in Ukraine, they have lots of distributed UAV production. They have lots and lots of both sort of centralized development and sort of tactical and technical development efforts, but also really, really good distributed development. So down to quite low unit echelons, they have teams who will tinker with drones, will remake them from components all the time, will improve them, will experiment with them in combat, will reprogram them at the unit level. Western militaries tend to be very bad at that kind of thing because we have regulatory standards, certification standards. We don't tend to delegate things like that down to certainly something like a company level. I can't see that happening in Western militaries in peacetime, at least. And not to mention, we tend to overspecify things and then try and scale them up and compete them with industry. In other words, for understandable reasons, and yes, there are some efforts to improve this, but I can't see it as credible as a pitch that before we get into a war, if we do, that Europe will be able to produce significantly more drones more innovatively and more quickly and more effectively than Ukraine has. They are world leaders at this, along with, unfortunately, the Russians. And also, as a side product of that, there's a big question of whether we would accept being as dependent on Chinese components as the Ukrainians and everybody else, apart from the US, are. The US military is trying to do FPV and other types of loitering munitions without reliance on Chinese components, and the costs are vastly higher. There've been quadcopters and things for like $50,000. So at that point, a lot of the cheap mass arguments just don't add up. But that's because the only main source of affordable drone engines, batteries, components, etc., tends to be from China. So there's also a question of reliance there and whether we want to do that. The Russians are really good at counter-US. B, the Ukrainians are doing it at a greater scale and better than we are, but they're still being slowly pushed back. So what FPVs and one-way attack drones are good at is basically causing affordable attrition. They're not really very good at breaking up concentrated massed pushes of maneuver forces with armor and artillery support and everything. For that, you want artillery, ATGMs, that kind of thing. And this is very much borne out by experience in Ukraine. But the Russian forces in Ukraine are, at least for now, constrained by minefields, by Ukrainian artillery, by GIMLers, by ATACMS, by Storm Shadow strikes in the deep. They are fighting in a dispersed, relatively inefficient way, and they've had most of their core maneuver units destroyed in terms of their ability to maneuver at regimental scale or above. So in that context, FPVs can be very efficient at kind of attriting slowly but constantly over time in a sustainable way. But bluntly, if attrition is your answer, it's not working, because the Russian force, despite having taken 1.1-ish million casualties since the start of the war, killed, wounded, missing, captured, is more than 3 times the size that it was when it started. So just on the basis of attrition, that doesn't seem to be a good answer for how to deter Russia. I'm not criticizing the Ukrainian strategy. They're doing the best with what they have. But for Europeans looking at this problem, how do we deter Russia by promising lethality? An attrition-based strategy that based on kind of we can cause you lots of damage over time and casualties, I don't think is going to be particularly convincing to the Russians, nor indeed to our own populations if we're telling them that that's how we're going to fight. And finally, in a linked way, we are very lucky in a way that the Ukrainians are not, which is, again, not their fault. But we're very lucky that we have better options. We've got all the ingredients to do phenomenally capable tactical air power with joint enablement. What we don't have are enough of the right munitions and some of the force protection elements that we need in place. But it is much easier to fill those gaps than to try to completely transform the art of war for all of the different armies in Europe. So in the time that we've got, or might have, because the Russians could pose us a pretty serious threat in the next 2-3 years. What I was attempting to do as an argument, because I do see it slightly worryingly often among people who are not particularly specialist, that essentially we're going to do drones on a big scale, and that's going to transform our lethality. And bluntly, if we think with a couple of tens or even hundreds of thousands of drones produced more slowly and less efficiently and more slowly and less responsively and more overregulated than Ukraine, without any of the combat experience and without it being a day-to-day factor for our forces, that somehow we'll be able to have far greater effectiveness than the Ukrainians have against the Russians, against whatever the Russians are in 2 to 3 years' time. I just don't see that as a credible proposition. The final thing I would say, though, as a positive thing, is that the more the Russians have to focus on the counter-UAS piece in Ukraine, the less they're going to be able to focus on rebuilding their ability to counter more traditional NATO capabilities, which have been attrited quite steadily throughout Ukraine, whether that's armored maneuver, artillery, air defenses, whatever. And would also want to make clear as a final thing as well, I'm definitely not saying that we shouldn't prioritize warfare involving UAVs in the sense that we need to have counter UAV capabilities, because the Russians will absolutely use these things against us in vast numbers if we have to fight them. So we do need counter UAS capabilities in our armies and for base defense, for example. But that's where I would put the UAV focused bulk of investment in Western forces at the moment, is in the counter UAS space, which doesn't require any particularly difficult technologies. It doesn't require any particularly high-risk things. It just requires spending money to optimize forces against a threat that we haven't really optimized against yet, which is exactly what the Russians are currently doing.
Well, your article is NATO-focused, but I would say that the United States is guilty of the same recency bias as our good friend Brian McGrath pointed out last year in one of his Substacks. And, this is evident in Project 2025's focus on the defense side of the house, and also the video that the Secretary of Defense did a couple of weeks ago on the one side of the Pentagon on the lawn there with drones all around him. They've said, and they use Ukraine as the sort of categorical example, that drones are the future and that modern warfare is going to be all about drones. And this, when you were saying that at the outset of this conversation, I'm thinking of at the end of World War II, where everybody's like, well, the next war is going to be nuclear. So everybody, if you're not nuke, you're irrelevant. And this scared the Navy and freaked everybody out. And I did that episode about the revolt of the admirals, about the concerns in that era. And obviously that didn't fortunately play out to be the case. And same here. The way you laid it out in this particular essay is right on in terms of the conditions that make drone tactical use viable and at all effective were created by conventional weaponry. Like you said, ATACMS and fires and directed fires that isolate Russian forces in a way that now you can cherry pick them, as it were, with drones. People see what's on social media, and you see the Russian soldier huddling in the trench, and the drone picks him off, or you see drones flying down a road, and here comes this transport, and all of a sudden it flies right into the windshield, and then it goes fuzzy, and we're like, oh my God, they're helpless, and this is the way that warfare is going to be done now. But those are very specific examples that were created by a wider conflict that used other weapon systems besides drones. So you point that out very deftly. The other thing that I want to put, double click on what you said and put a finer point on it, in spite of the fact that Ukraine is the world leader in drone innovation and use on the battlefield, they're still not winning. They're not losing, and maybe they've reduced the rate at which they are losing at best, but they're not winning. So before we go all in on drones, we have to be mindful of that fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing to note is, not saying that FPV and other types of UAS won't be an important facet of ground combat in future. I'm sure they will. It's undoubtedly true. But what I'm arguing against, or trying to, is this idea that they're going to replace everything and that they're the key to lethality. Because actually, the more you bet on them, the easier they are to counter if you're betting on them to the exclusion of other things. And there's only so much money, people, organizational priority, logistics support to go around. So ultimately, you are making choices between certain systems and certain other systems. uncrewed systems still require a lot of people to use and support. Like, you have to move a lot of batteries and explosives and, just components, and you use these things in great quantities. So it ends up being very personnel intensive to run as a capability. And in some cases, it's the best answer. For Ukraine, it probably is the best answer at the minute, until we can get them more artillery. The other point is that even though they will be a feature for a long time to come, firstly, counter-UAS capabilities can be made really pretty effective across the board. They will never be 100% protection, but then again, neither is body armor protection against 100% of bullets, or, foxholes protection against artillery. It's about, can that capability provide you a battle-winning edge or not? Is this the thing that is going to define whether you succeed or not? And ultimately, it is much harder as a physics problem and a technical problem and a tactical problem to stop, let's say, a combined arms brigade or division that is working as a combined arms brigade or division as the US Army, for example, understands it, or would understand it. It is much harder to stop them advancing than the same number of people with a bunch of FPV drones, as long as you have counter-UAS capabilities. But of course, if you've already lost the formations that can operate like that, as the Russians and the Ukrainians have, and you're in largely positional warfare without enough people to cover the whole front line, there are situations where absolutely they're effective. But I just don't think that's the sort of thing that European, and indeed certainly for the Indo-Pacific, the US, should be prioritizing as the core of their lethality as a tool of deterrence. Not least because the Russians are very unlikely to be worried by it. But there are plenty of very useful ways that uncrewed systems can enable and make much more effective, force multiply more traditional weapon systems. So, for example, the Israeli air operations against Iran in Operation Rising Lions, the 12-day war, as the administration in the US is calling it, there were some really innovative uses of, well, not innovative necessarily, but very, very tactically adept uses of small UAS to disable and destroy various air defense elements and missile launchers for ballistic missiles and things by special operations forces that had infiltrated ahead of time and were coordinating with the air assault. Although that is clearly not utterly required, in the sense that the Israelis were already able to just do the bulk of the destruction of Iranian early warning and fire control radars for their long-range S-300 systems back in October, when they conducted those strikes in October last year. Without those infiltrated soft teams, they were still able to get the access they needed and start degrading the air defense network. So a useful enabler, but not the only key. I've seen a few, or one specific drone evangelist claiming that, or implying that the only reason the Israelis were able to get air superiority was because they had teams with small drones. So that's just not borne out by the op analysis. But in any case, the key thing there is they are very useful. But the primary thing that the Israelis have that Europe does not currently have, and the reason they were able to gain air superiority pretty much on the first night, despite their limited ability to project vast numbers of sorties that distance, they don't have a huge tanker fleet, was that they have high-end destruction of air defenses munitions. They have Rocks, they have Rampage, and they have Delilah, as well as F-35 to find, fix, suppress, and the DIAD munitions are carried on F-15s and F-16s that go with. There's loads we can learn and really should be learning in Europe from this. You need the high-end effectors. So, maybe for political reasons, most countries probably wouldn't buy them from Israel at the moment. But, that leaves AARGM-ER, maybe Norwegian strike missile, possibly the UK Spear if we weren't so slow about it. There are effectors. There's also obviously ground launch things, precision strike missile, which is the successor to ATACMS, or ATACMS if you have it. Not many countries do. GIMLRs if you can get closer, so ground GPS guided multiple launch rocket systems, or even just artillery if you're close enough. For example, for the Russian air defenses in Kaliningrad, there's quite a lot of Polish artillery that could be within range of quite a lot of their sites. As long as you can get F-35s, for example, close enough to do the find, fix, and suppress past targets with the right C2, great. As part of that, one-way attack, decoy-type UAS, and stand-in jammers could be hugely useful. But they're probably coming out of ground units, so that, even if they're Air Force launched, there'll be Air Force ground units that are launching them, probably from not too far away from the area of operations, because they're slow and you don't want to give the enemy huge amounts of advance warning that this is about to happen. But yeah, would it be helpful to a SIAD DIAD campaign to have several hundred decoy things with a few that go bang, that are propeller powered and go several hundred kilometers into Kaliningrad, Kola, wherever, and some stand-in jammers for some higher end payloads in and amongst that? Absolutely. That's transformative for your ability to get your high-end munitions through and start killing those main radars, those command posts, those key air defense targets, so that the next pulse is easier and the next pulse is easier and the next pulse is easier to get to the goal, which is your ability to use JDAM, Paveway, Hellfire, all of these incredibly efficient, high-yield, air-delivered direct attack munitions, which are the secret sauce in effect. People say quadcopters are so incredibly cheap. You've got, let's say, they're $500 to $1,000 depending on the fit, and it only takes 10 to 15 on average to disable a tank and maybe 30 to kill it. Okay, but a GBU-38 costs $18,000 and will kill any known tank in one, and you can carry loads of them on even an F-16 and deliver lots per mission with a targeting pod from a single aircraft, and they're easy to make, and we've got stockpiles of them, and you can do it repeatedly. Without the travel time and the lag and the unreliability and the vulnerability to EW and all the other things that come with FPVs as a limitation. There's a very good reason why Western joint forces have optimized over time so heavily around essentially tactical air power, which is not just that we like it and that, I often hear people go, oh, the military industrial complex loves this stuff. It's actually not great for a lot of bits of the military-industrial complex over time, because it means your overall forces can be much smaller and have much smaller stockpiles of a lot of ammunition and heavy vehicles and other things, which otherwise the military-industrial complex, as in Russia or China, would be cranking out. It's because it's a really efficient way to do firepower, and it's better than anything else we've ever come up with. All of that counter A2AD stuff, and indeed those A2AD networks that the Iranians previously had, that the Russians developed, the Chinese are developing and continuing to develop, they are all in service of keeping us away from being able to do that thing, which is put overhead above with JDAMs and paveways and annihilate any army that is put in the field efficiently and scalably. You really did see it, whatever you think of the politics, between the Israeli Air Force and the Iranians in that 12-day campaign. One side had hundreds of thousands of UAVs of all types and tens of thousands of high-end ballistic and cruise missiles. So exactly the sort of force that a lot of the, for want of a better term, tech evangelists would like us to construct. Long-range precision fires and loads of drones of all kinds. And the other side had a traditional air force with careful enablement from some uncrewed systems as well. And that was an incredibly one-sided outcome. I don't think anybody looking at that military exchange would want to be on the Iranian side of it from a force design point of view. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that particularly Russia and Europe is not doable with more traditional means. It absolutely is. And what's more, the Russians are much more likely to be scared of those kind of means if we can demonstrate them credibly than they are of us basically going, we're going to do what the Ukrainians did, but slower, less efficiently, and at a smaller scale. Spread among 30 different nations. From a deterrent point of view, it doesn't make sense to me as an approach. And in the Indo-Pacific, the distances are such that for the US, again, one-way attack systems to saturate, decoy, stand-in jamming to enable you to get your pulses of long-range strike munitions and long-range assets like B-21 through to where you need to, absolutely. They're probably going to have to be deployed from extra-large underwater uncrewed vehicles, XLU UVs, or from forward areas like the Philippines, Taiwan, wherever. But it's in service of getting the high end in there, partly because your other main problem as the US looking at China is an anti-ship problem, and small FPVs aren't going to do you much good there. Very smart uncrewed underwater vehicles might, but the smaller weaponized versions of those are called torpedoes. We've had them for a long time.
Not a new thing. As always, brilliant analysis from two-time Moochie Award-winning Professor Justin Bronk. Justin, thanks again for giving us the time today. People can find your writing at rusi.org, and we look forward to having you on the channel again very soon.
Thanks, Mooch. Always a pleasure.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.